Greetings to you all. Welcome back again to the lecture series on Virginia Woolf, who has been known as a great feminist and a great writer. Virginia Woolf has been prescribed in the course of MA Semester 2nd, Unit 2nd B1. In the last video, we had seen how the idea of a room of one's own originated in the mind of Virginia Woolf. We have also seen what were the arguments that she provided in writing A Room of One's Own. In this video, we'll be seeing and discussing in detail the chapter 2nd of A Room of One's Own. She writes, women have always been poor, not for 200 years merely, but from the beginning of time. Women then have not had a dog's chance of writing poetry. That is why I have laid so much stress on money and a room of one's own. Now let us proceed to the chapter 2nd and what are the points that she mentions in her extended essay. Now the scene changes from Oxbridge to London, and here the narrator is sitting in a room attempting to write about women and fiction. She reviews the questions that were raised during the previous day at Oxbridge. Why did men drink wine and women water? Why was one sex so prosperous and the other so poor? What effect has poverty on fiction? What conditions are necessary for the creation of work of art? And then she resolves upon a trip to the British Museum in order to strain off what was personal and accidental in all these expressions and impression and so reach the pure fluid, the essential oil of truth. She looks in the catalogue in the British Library of Books about women and marvels at how many have been written by women and under the rubrics of how many different disciplines. Checking the M listings, she finds that no such archive exists on the topic of males. Arbitrarily selecting a few of these books, she finds a great array of opinions and topics, and finally, she pauses resentfully with one professor's statements of the mental, moral, and physical inferiority of women. She decides that these studies, whatever their differences had all, been written in the red light of emotion and not in the white light of truth. They betray an underlying anger that prevents them from approaching their subject objectively. Why are they angry? The narrator asks herself as she breaks from lunch. She concludes that if the author of the study on the inferiority of women had argued dispassionately, she would not have become incensed herself. I had been angry because he was angry. The narrator intuits a depth of motivation and response underlying this issue, and she decides that male scholars have been less interested in the inferiority of women than in preserving and authenticating their sense of male superiority. Women have served as mirrors to men in this sense for centuries. Here, the narrator is interrupted by the necessity of paying the bill. She takes the opportunity, while on the subject of her own finances, to inform us that she was left a legacy of £500 a year by her aunt, Mary Baton. She remembers getting the letter at the same time that women were granted the vote and observes that the inheritance was more important in securing her freedom. It relieved her not only of the obligation to work for a living, but also of hatred and bitterness of temperament. It allowed her to forgive men for their collective injustices toward women and to see males too as victims in some ways of their education and culture. Ultimately, the financial freedom gave her the freedom to think of things in themselves. Returning home, the narrator finds herself entering into a strikingly domestic setting. She thinks to herself that it is nearly impossible to say whether the kind of labor that have traditionally been performed by women are more or less valuable than the work done by women? The question is unanswerable. Not only does domestic labor fall outside of any economic indexes of value, but its cultural value also changes from decade to decade. She envisions a future in which there will be no gender based division of labor. But what bearing has this all upon the subject of my paper? Women in fiction? She wonders as she enters the house. She writes in her essay, Life for both sexes, and I look at them, shouldering their way along the pavement, is arduous, difficult, a perpetual struggle. It calls for gigantic courage and strength. More than anything, perhaps, creatures of illusion that we are, it calls for confidence in oneself. Moving on to the third chapter, we find that the narrator returns home disappointed at not having rounded up some useful tidbit of truth from her researches at the British Library. She turns at this point to history, which she conjectures records not opinions but facts. As her starting point, she chooses to look into the lives of English women during the Elizabethan period. Elizabethan period, which was an era of surpassing literary accomplishment, but only among men. It is a virtue of Shakespeare's plays, she observes, that they seem like enchanted spider webs to hang there complete by themselves. In reality, however, even his works are not spun in midair by incorporeal creatures, but are the real work of suffering human beings and are attached to grossly material things like health and money and the houses we live in. History turns up little except a few terse statements about the legal rights of women in the early modern period. This reticent on the topic of women and the fact of her utter powerlessness strikes discordantly with the prevalence in literature of complex and strong female characters from ancient times to the present. A very queer, composite being thus emerges. Imaginatively, she is of the highest importance. Practically, she is completely insignificant. Some of the most inspired words, some of the most profound thoughts in literature fall from her lips. In real life, she could hardly read, could scarcely spell, and was the property of her husband. In light of this paradox, the solution to the problem of trying to conceptualize the Elizabethan woman seems to be to pool the resources of history and fiction. It would have been impossible. The narrator concludes from this thought experiment. It would have been impossible completely and entirely for any woman to have written the plays of Shakespeare in the age of Shakespeare. To illustrate this conclusion, she conjures the imaginary character of Judith Shakespeare. Judith is as gifted perhaps as her brother, but receives no education except that which she can create for herself in what free time she has. Although she is the apple of her father's eye, her family expects her to conform to a social role that leaves no room for the development of her talent. She writes some in secret, but hides or burns her work for a fear of reprisal. She becomes engaged at a young age. When she begs to be allowed not to marry, she is chastised and beaten by her father. After this, she runs away, driven by the force of her own gift alone. She wants to go into acting, but meets with rejection and ridicule. She is finally taken up by a theatre manager, becomes pregnant by him, and commits suicide. This is how the life of a woman with Shakespeare genius might have looked at that time, the narrator argues. But she goes on to assert that it is unthinkable that any woman in Shakespeare's day should have had Shakespeare's genius, or no more than the first germ of genius, and certainly not the kind that would ever have translated itself into brilliant writing. For genius is not born among laboring, uneducated, servile people, except with rarest exceptions. And even then, that social condition glares through as a limitation of the art. In that is, genius engendered witches and lunatics among women. And Anonymous, she argues, was most likely a woman as well. Having explored the deep inner conflicts that a gifted woman must have felt during the Renaissance, the narrator goes on to ask, what is the state of mind that is most propitious to the act of creation? She marvels at the prodigious difficulty of producing a work of genius and observes that circumstances generally conspire against it. She cites as obstacles the indifference of most of the world, the profusion of distractions, and the heaping up of various forms of discouragement. This is true for all artists, but how much more so for women? A woman would not even have a room of her own unless her parents were exceptionally wealthy, and in her spending money and discretionary time, she would be totally at the mercy of others. Being regularly told of female ineptitude, women would surely have internalized that belief. The absence of any tradition of female intellectuals would have made such arguments all the more valuable. Though we like to think of genius as transcendent, the narrator holds that the mind of the artist is actually particularly susceptible to discouragement and vulnerable to the opinion of others. The mind of the artist, he says, must be incandescent. There must be no obstacle in it, no foreign matter consumed. So, this was what Virginia Woolf wrote in her chapter 3rd and chapter 2nd of A Room of One's Own. We'll be back with the next series, with the next lecture of this series, in which we'll be dealing with chapter 5th and chapter 6th of A Room of One's Own. Till then, take care. Goodbye.